All right, I've got the time. So, our final talk of our 2023 Virtual BioTAP Conference is going to be given by Kaylin McAnally. So, I will turn it over to you. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Everyone good on screen and sound? All right,
Looks and sounds good. Yep.
great. So thank you all for sticking around till the end of the conference. It's been great to everybody's talk. This is my first time at BioTAP, so I've been happy to be included. So my name is Kaylin McAnally Starr, and today I will be presenting on some qualitative research I've been working on with some collaborators, basically trying to answer the question, are graduate students culturally responsive and inclusive in their teaching? So there are academic structures and just structures within the United States, unfortunately, that perpetuate the exclusion of peers, persons excluded because of their ethnicity and race. And of course, there are many other groups which are excluded as well within these structures. And within academia, this is especially prevalent in STEM. Peers are often underrepresented in the undergraduate population, in grad student population, in the postdoc population, and in faculty populations. And because of this, they face unique obstacles. These can be a variety of things, but maybe less opportunities for mentoring, worse quality mentoring when they do receive it, less opportunities for internships, for kind of extracurricular activities, less access to professors, perhaps less understanding from professors. And these obstacles just kind of perpetuate this exclusion and reiterate these structures of oppression and inequity. But there are individuals with power in the academic structure who can use their privilege and their power to hopefully enact change. And these are people like professors or academic advisors, instructors, and their roles of power can combat some of these systems of inequity. This can also include graduate teaching assistants. And as everybody knows, because you're at this conference here, graduate teaching assistants have this kind of unique opportunity where they have a lot of face time with students. Maybe they're teaching a lab, maybe they're holding office hours. And because of this, they have a lot of undergraduate student interaction. And therefore, they're holding this position of power within academia. And they have the chance to utilize asset-based teaching strategies and inclusive teaching practices that can promote equity, promote inclusion, and hopefully combat some of these systems of inequity within academia. So the framework for our study is culturally responsive science teaching, which is a pedagogical approach that is kind of a new take on some of the classic kind of inclusive teaching or scientific teaching practices. So culturally responsive science teaching was developed by Dr. Hilary Barron, and she's one of the collaborators on this paper. And there are three main tenets to culturally responsive science teaching. The first is sociopolitical consciousness. And sociopolitical consciousness basically states that within a classroom, academic content should tie into local or national current events, and that you should tie in national or local current events with academic content. And this allows students to make real world connections between things that are happening around them with things they are learning in the classroom. The second tenet of culturally responsive science teaching is funds of knowledge. And funds of knowledge suggests that student perspectives, student lived experiences should be used as like a framework for academic content as well. And that this really promotes student science identity when you're able to ask undergraduate students what they've learned in the past, what they've experienced. What did your parent teach you about this scientific process when you were growing up? And how can those personal lived experiences promote learning in the classroom? The third tenet is just general connections, which focus on success and competency. measuring student success and competency in a variety of ways as opposed to traditional methods of exams and memorization. But how do we really promote student self-efficacy, student academic and science identity? And how do we do that through forming connections between the student, who they are, and the classroom content? So with culturally responsive science teaching as our background, as our framework, we had two research questions about graduate teaching assistants. So our first refers to, how do grad teaching assistants use inclusive teaching practice and culturally responsive science teaching? And then the second is, what are their barriers to doing so? And we'll get into the context design in a minute, but there was kind of a training introduced, and we were asking, did the responses to these questions change pre and post training? So the trainings were delivered as a part of an elective course in life sciences at University of California, Merced. So this class was about teaching professional development and was really geared towards life sciences graduate students. The course was not mandatory, so can tie into why students enrolled in that, thinking about our last presentation. But students who were enrolled in this elective teaching professional development course then had the opportunity to consent to being a part of this study. The class itself was delivered virtually in the fall of 2020. The class was taught by Dr. Kranzfelder, who is also a collaborator on this paper. The participants received two trainings, and the trainings were delivered by Dr. Barron, who developed culturally responsive science teaching. And the trainings as a part of this teaching professional development course were on inclusive science teaching and culturally responsive science teaching, and covered a variety of things, but a couple topics were listed here: structural inequities, active learning, personal biases, things like that. So the participants, the graduate students who consented to being a part of the study, completed open-ended surveys regarding their inclusive teaching practices, their culturally responsive science teaching, and their barriers before and after they received the training as a part of the course. So in addition to these kind of open-ended surveys, the participants also completed teaching reflections, which prompted the grad students to kind of reflect on things they were learning in the course. It's kind of much more open. What did you think about this? And those were given multiple times throughout the course. And because the course was on Zoom, there was kind of the opportunity to collect some really unique session artifacts. Things like Zoom chats during the classroom, document discussions were also used as a data source. So the surveys were inductively coded by myself and another researcher. We did an open coding method where we observed the survey responses and created codes, had consensus meetings, and developed a coding scheme to inductively code our survey responses. That coding scheme was then used to deductively code the teaching reflections and the session artifacts. And different researchers coded each of the three different data sources to try to ensure validity across our team. We had many meetings and discussions about what our codes meant. And these three data sources were then used to triangulate one another to promote validity in our data as well. We had 5 graduate students consent to being a part of this study. And I will preface my results by saying that we have a lot more data than I'm able to get into in our presentation today, but hopefully we'll be sharing this in a publication early next year, so stay tuned for that. But today I'm just going to be focusing on some of our open-ended survey responses to our research questions. So our first question asked how graduate teaching assistants used inclusive teaching practices in culturally responsive science teaching. And we asked this before they received any relevant training in our professional development course, at least. How do you use inclusive teaching practices? One of our graduate students, Lizzie, said, I always start the class with trying to make a comfortable vibe. I always ask them, the students, how they're doing. I try to give everyone, no matter their race, gender, or background, a chance to speak in class And if they aren't talkative, I go up to them, I ask how it's going, if they have questions. So we coded this as facilitating emotional comfort, and that is how Lizzie uses inclusive teaching practices in the classroom. And this was kind of nice to see, encouraging to see that before there was any training specifically on inclusive teaching practices or culturally responsive science teaching, we already have a grad student saying, this is what I'm doing. I'm creating this nice environment for my students. So this was an encouraging kind of first response to see. Next, we looked at responses to the same question after the training. How did graduate teaching assistants use inclusive teaching practices and culturally responsive science teaching after they've received training? One of our graduate students, Noah, said, I've had students share cool things they've learned as an icebreaker, and it often touches on culturally relevant practices, what people learn at home with their families. Many people share practices or can contrast their own. We coded this as connecting with student funds of knowledge. And if you remember, funds of knowledge was one of the key tenets of culturally responsive science teaching, where academic success is prompted by relating academic content with student lived experiences. So we were so excited to see this, that after we did a training on culturally responsive science teaching, we have a graduate student saying, this is what I'm doing. I'm creating these icebreakers. I'm giving students opportunities to share their personal experiences. And it's tying in with other students, and other students are able to compare and contrast and think and tie that into the academic material. So this was awesome for us to see. Moving on to our second research question, we're assessing how grad students use these things. Well, what's getting in the way? How do graduate students describe their barriers to engaging in these pedagogies? And we asked this first question before training. Solaris, one of our participants, said, some barriers I have encountered are a lack of training for TAs to implement or reorder existing curriculum or course structures, inclusive teaching practices if they are not already considered. We coded this as a lack of training. And this kind of makes sense, right? Maybe a lack of training is a barrier to engaging in these inclusive pedagogies, especially if you haven't received any training yet. And our sample here is admittedly maybe really interested in teaching professional development. They enrolled in the class. But it can still be really overwhelming to think about implementing this new kind of inclusive structure if you haven't learned about it before, or if you're learning about it for the first time, even if you do care. Then lastly, what were some of the barriers that graduate students mentioned after they received training? Kendall said, my biggest barrier to inclusive teaching is the struggle I feel exists between being inclusive in one aspect that then contributes to being exclusive in another aspect. And this one actually showed up a couple of times, which was surprising, which was very surprising to us, because we coded this as the barrier was achieving equality. But that wasn't really what the training was focused on. The training was very equity-minded, equity-focused, and this perceived barrier of achieving equality was kind of an interesting finding that we didn't necessarily expect. The graduate students are worried about kind of equally including everybody. And this may actually point to kind of a future direction in clarifying some of these tenets in teaching assistant professional development. So those were some of my highlighted results. And like I said, I'm happy to talk more about some other findings or share the paper when it comes out, hopefully. But next, I'd like to just go through a few of our potential implications for the research. So the first is regarding the use of inclusive teaching practices in culturally responsive science teaching. And that is that we've seen graduate teaching assistants are already doing some of these things without even knowing it. So before receiving training, before they've gone through the course, we have multiple graduate teaching assistants saying, I'm facilitating support, in my classroom. I'm learning my students' names, their pronouns, their personal history. And I'm creating a classroom culture where students feel connected to me, where students feel comfortable, and this is a priority for me. So this was really encouraging for us to see. And again, this may be influenced by our sample, a little bit of sample bias, but it's still encouraging nonetheless to see that there are graduate teaching assistants who are doing these things without receiving formal training. Next implication is regarding our barriers. And pre and post, we noticed that teaching assistants were reporting a lack of time and a lack of training as big barriers to engaging in these inclusive teaching practices. This was kind of interesting. It makes sense before training. I don't really know what this is. I feel like I don't have enough training to implement these things. But even after the training, students were still saying, okay, well, I learned about it, but I still don't feel like I'm equipped to engage in these things in my classroom. And this can potentially point to a future direction in empowering graduate teaching assistants and saying that they can engage in these practices. And this was also interesting because it's a little bit counterintuitive to our first point. We have students who, or graduate students who are engaging in these inclusive methods, but then maybe they hear a training and then they are overwhelmed, like, well, maybe I can't do that. Maybe I don't know how to do that, even though they already are. So this was an interesting finding that can definitely point to future TA professional development. And then lastly, although we did not test an official like pre-post design or look at the effects of an intervention, there did seem to be changes in the response of use and barriers from our teaching assistants before and after our training, which suggests that teaching assistants may be able to take in aspects from these trainings regarding culturally responsive science teaching and inclusive teaching practices to become more inclusive and equitable instructors, which is, of course, our goal. All right, with that, I would like to thank my team of collaborators. We're all over the country doing the research on inclusive teaching and culturally responsive science teaching. I also like to thank our participants and our funding source as well. My email is at the bottom here, and I'm happy to be in touch with any questions or conversations, and I'm also happy to take any questions at this time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. And yes, we do have time for questions. So pop them in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Hi,
Great
Caitlin.
talk. I had
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, great talk. Thank you. I had a question. I was curious how big was your sample? Like yeah, that's my question. Thanks.
So we had 5 graduate students consent to being a part of this study. The class was a little bit bigger. I think there were 9 students in the class, but of that class, so it was pretty small, but they gave us really good responses.
Awesome. Thank you.
Hi, Caitlin. Great talk. It's very interesting. My name is Star. I just had a quick question about what your sense is from like what the TAs might actually be doing in terms of practice, in the classroom, and if you have a sense of what the student perspective might be of their TAs using inclusive practices. Have you had a chance to look at that?
So we don't have undergrad student data, but we did have some responses from the teaching assistants saying my students liked it when I did X, Y, and Z. But the descriptions of use, like of practice, so what you're referring to, really kind of varied. So these are STEM teaching assistants. So typically they have lab sections or discussion sections, and the descriptions really varied among our participants. We had some people saying, I don't really have the opportunity to do this because I'm only a teaching assistant, which was another kind of thing I didn't mention in this talk, but like, okay, well, we still have some room to work with here. Where other people described the more emotional aspect, and other people described sharing their own stories, or like humanizing themselves, like, well, this is how I got to this point. These are how my identities have shaped who I am. And other people talked about kind of differentiating their instruction, including active learning practices, trying to scaffold information from lecture. So the descriptions from our participants really varied widely, including kind of academic or emotional or their own personal stories. But they also kind of very differ talking about inclusive teaching or culturally responsive teaching. But the focus did seem to be kind of student success, which was encouraging.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask another question?
Of course.
I was curious about the relationship between like power, like the position, like power position between the TAs and that emotional support that we can give to the undergrad students. Sometimes I feel that, oh, because I have been trained, you are the person of power in that room. It's like it's hard. You cannot be approachable to the students, so it seems that they are afraid of asking questions. So I was wondering, what has been your experience, or based on this study that you have done, like what is the relationship between these power dynamics and how we can be more approachable for the students? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that being aware of the power dynamic that's inherent is a great first step. And I think that when I first started as a teaching assistant, I just thought, oh, I'm just like you. Like, and you obviously know that I'm just like you. But that's not the case. And a lot of undergraduate students are like view teaching assistants with this kind of authority or power. It's like, oh, I'm kind of intimidated by you, or I'm scared of you. And understanding that is the view that undergraduate students might have, especially depending on your institutional context. We have a lot of first generation college students at UC Merced, and those cultural views definitely shape the power dynamics that exist within our academic university structure. So I think being aware of it is a good first step in knowing, like, okay, this is how students may view me, but I can humanize myself and give students opportunities to interact with me, and I can interact with them by sharing my story, by asking them about their story, by being approachable, by having kind of this asset mindset, by not, I mean, I don't think anyone at this conference would like ridicule someone if they got something wrong, but you just want to be approachable, right? You want to create this opportunity for growth in your classroom. So I think that that's maybe a first step, is understanding the power dynamic and then working to kind of go to your students instead of having your students come to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Kaylin. All right, we will wrap that up today for the talks. We have a couple minutes before we kick off our community social hour. I know there are mixed opinions of such social hour, looking at one person in particular, but I think we'll have fun. It'll be very informal. If you aren't sticking around for that, again, thank you for being here. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Dr. Shortledge for the keynote and for our presidential address yesterday as well. It's really been a great conference, and hope to see you in a couple minutes as we officially wrap things up.